I don't know why I'm doing this today. Maybe because it rained this morning and the sound of it on the window took me somewhere I haven't been in a long time. Maybe because my daughter called last night and I couldn't sleep after. Maybe because I'm 81 years old and I've started to feel time differently. Not like a river anymore. More like the last few swallows of something warm in a cup you know you won't refill. My name is Walter Grimes. I'm 81, and I've been sitting in this chair for about an hour trying to decide if what I'm about to say is worth saying. I think it is. I think it might be the most honest thing I've ever allowed myself to say out loud. This is about people, about the ones who made me feel small, and about what I did with that feeling for most of my life. I grew up in a house where you didn't answer back. My father wasn't a cruel man. I want to be fair to him even now. He worked, he provided, he showed up every morning to a job that humiliated him quietly every single day, and he came home and sat at the head of that table like a man who'd decided dignity was something you performed, not something you felt. And when he spoke to you in a certain tone, the kind of tone that made the air in the room go still, you learned very quickly that the correct response was silence. So I learned silence. I learned it the way children learn things that nobody teaches them, naturally, without knowing they're learning it at all. I was maybe 9 or 10 when a boy at school, bigger than me, red-faced, always smelling faintly of something I couldn't name then, but now know was a difficult home, started calling me names. Nothing spectacular, just the ordinary cruelty children practice on each other. But it happened every day, in the hallway, at lunch, sometimes on the walk home when he'd appear from somewhere like he'd been waiting. And what did I do? I smiled, I shrugged, I walked faster, I told myself it didn't matter. That was the first time I made that choice, and I remember the feeling afterward. Not relief, not strength, just a kind of hollow quiet, like I'd swallowed something that wasn't meant to be swallowed. I didn't have the words for it then, I do now. I had decided at 9 years old that I was not someone who deserved to take up space. The years between boyhood and middle age are strange to look back on. They compress. All that living, all those hours, and what you're left with are maybe 30 or 40 moments that feel real, that feel like they actually happened to a person who was present for them. I got married at 26 to a woman named Eleanor. Dark hair, laughed with her whole body. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and the room became more itself somehow, more alive. I loved her in the way young men love things they don't fully understand yet, completely, recklessly, without any idea of the cost. We had 2 children, a daughter, Rebecca, a son, Michael. I worked in insurance for 34 years. 34 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment because I still can't fully sit with it myself. There was a man I worked under for 11 of those years. His name was Gerald Putnam. He was the kind of man who'd decided somewhere along the way that his authority gave him permission to speak to people in ways that left marks, not bruises, nothing you could point to, just a slow, steady erosion of something inside you. He would say things in meetings, in front of everyone, a comment about a report I'd prepared. Walter seems to have done his best, which is well what it is, and people would shift in their seats and not quite laugh and not quite not laugh, and I would look down at my folder and I would feel something hot move through me, and then I would let it go. That's what I called it then, letting it go, like it was a virtue, like I was doing something noble. I let it go 11 years, Every week, sometimes more than once a week, the comments, the dismissals, the way he'd speak over me in a sentence and then continue on like my words hadn't said anything, like the words had simply dissolved before they could reach anyone's ears. 11 years. Eleanor used to ask me about it at dinner. She could always tell when I'd come home carrying something. She had that way about her, an attention that felt like being seen too clearly sometimes. "He did it again, didn't he?" she'd say, not a question. And I'd say, "It's fine, he's just like that." And she'd look at me for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she'd nod and pass the bread, and the conversation would move somewhere else. But I remember one night she didn't move the conversation. One night she put her fork down, and she looked at me and she said, "Walter, you know you're allowed to say something." And I said, "What would that accomplish?" And she said, "I don't know, maybe nothing, but you'd still have said it." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about it for years, honestly, what she meant by that. The idea that saying something had value independent of its outcome, that speaking wasn't just about changing the other person, that it was also about not abandoning yourself. I didn't understand it then, not really. Want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 53. Rebecca, my daughter, she was 24 then, just starting out, working at a firm downtown. She called me one afternoon, and she was upset in the way she tried to hide when she didn't want to worry me, her voice too even, too careful. She told me about a supervisor who had spoken to her in a way that wasn't right, who had made her feel, in her words, like she was ridiculous for having said anything at all. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table, Eleanor in the other room, and I felt something move through me that I didn't expect. Not just anger at this person for doing this to my daughter, something older than that. I felt recognition, and with the recognition came something that took me a while to name. Shame. Not at her, never at her, at myself, at the lifetime of practice I'd given her in watching her father accept what shouldn't be accepted, at all the dinners where I'd said it's fine and moved on, at the model I'd been, quietly, without ever intending it. I told her she was right to be upset. I told her that what he did wasn't acceptable, and she said, "So what do I do, Dad?" And I said something that I have thought about every year since. I said, "I don't know, sweetheart. I never really figured that out myself." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Oh." Just that, just "oh." And in that single syllable I heard something I hadn't expected to hear. Not disappointment exactly, something gentler than that, and somehow harder to carry. She still believed at 24 that her father had worked these things out, that the calm way I moved through the world was wisdom rather than avoidance, that the silence I wore was chosen, not inherited. Oh, I think about that phone call more than she knows. I wonder sometimes if she still thinks about it too. The thing about disrespect, and I've spent a lot of years turning this over, the way you turn a stone over and over in your pocket until it's smooth. The thing about it is that it rarely arrives as something obvious. It doesn't usually come in shouting or insults, not in my experience. It comes quietly. It comes in the small moments that are too small to report, too ordinary to name, but which accumulate over years into something heavy and permanent. A tone of voice, an interruption that happens just slightly too often, the way someone looks at you when you're speaking that tells you without a single word that they are waiting for you to finish rather than listening, a comment shaped like a joke, a silence where acknowledgement should have been. These things don't leave marks you can show anyone, but they leave marks. I retired at 62. Gerald Putnam had moved on by then, promoted up and away like the system always seems to do with men like that, and in his absence I realized something that sat uncomfortably with me for a long time. I missed the certainty. Not him, not the comments, but the structure he'd given me, the clear shape of who I was supposed to be inside that dynamic, the role I'd played so long I'd stopped noticing I was playing it. Without him, without that daily practice of shrinking, I didn't quite know what size I was. That frightened me more than I knew how to say. Eleanor got sick at 68. It came on slowly, then all at once, the way those things do. The last year of her life, she lost a lot of her words. It happened gradually, like a tide going out, and there were days when she could reach them, and days when they were too far. We learned to be together differently in that time, without language as our structure, without the conversations we'd had for 41 years as the foundation. We just sat together, a lot of sitting, and one afternoon, autumn, the light coming through at that angle that makes everything look like it's being remembered, even as it happens, she took my hand and